Then when I say something wrong, we'll have evidence that I said something wrong.
Exactly.
Okay. And as we get started, I guess Joanna or Tara, or Steve, did you guys, I guess Steve's not on, but did you all want to say something before I get kicked off and going?
Yeah, I did want to say that, we are offering those continuing education credits for this workshop. You'll need to attend both today and tomorrow, and beyond for the duration of the training, and then participate in the poll questions in order to receive the credits. And you don't necessarily have to get them right, although we would prefer you try to and pay attention. But I just wanted to start by saying that and thanking everybody for being here. And we hope you find this to be a valuable training, and we're happy that we're able to host this for you guys. And thanks, John, for being our instructor today.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and get started, I guess. And it sounds like you guys are stuck with me until 3 o'clock. Sorry. We'll try to keep this as entertaining and then as interactive as possible. Maybe. There we go. So my name is John Covey. I currently work for Wood. I've been doing flood risk, flood mitigation, urban stormwater, watershed planning, flood control type projects for 16 years. Really all across the North American continent, but certainly the US. So with that, I'm going to try to bring a little bit of perspective of, what I've seen, some lessons learned as we go through this process. For this part one, as Tara alluded to, this is part 1 of 2. We have part 2 tomorrow. Part 1, I'm going to do an introduction of what we're going to talk about, an overview of what a LOMC is. And then this part 1 is going to principally cover the MT applications, the MT1 applications and MTEZ applications. Whereas in part 2, we're going to really focus on the MT2 applications. We got a little bit of an exercise tomorrow that I'm going to run through to do a LOMR and talk about, and really lessons learned. I'm going to try to talk through all this as we go. As I mentioned, I'm taking it from a consultant's perspective, I guess. So with that being said, I definitely would like input from the group as we go through this. We actually have a fairly small group as compared to the last workshop. So we want to try to make this interactive. My goals of this workshop, or this 2-part workshop, is that you understand what the LOMC process are and what LOMC options are available to you. Understand the applications, both MT1 and MT2 applications, and maybe learn some lessons. And maybe I'll learn some lessons from you. Most importantly, we're going to be together for the better part of 6 hours, 3 hours today or 2 hours, 2 hours today and 2 hours tomorrow. So that being said, let's have some fun. Let's try to make this entertaining. LOMCs and LOMRs may seem a little boring, but they're a very important part of our mapping or floodplain management processes. So let's try to make the most of it as best we can. We got some lectures. You're going to hear me talk, blabbering on, and then we've got some demonstrations. I'm going to open up some things, show you how to work within some of the content that we use when we file a LOMR or one of these applications. But one of the other things I wanted to mention here is, the last class was very large. This class is very small. Interrupt me as we go through here. If you have questions, maybe you have examples that you've ran across where something I'm saying didn't work and why. That information is valuable because I can be the first to tell you, having been a part of LOMRs across the country, while FEMA and everybody does their best to streamline that process and make it as consistent as possible, there are subtle differences between the different areas. And so understanding problems that people have had in the past or things that they've heard, I think is valuable for everybody. Chances are, if you have a question, there may be another person that has that same question. So feel free to bring it up. No question is a bad question, in my opinion. Some resources, I'm going to reference a lot the FEMA website. They have a ton of online resources that you can go to. You can call them, you can even chat with them, and talk to a specialist that does reviews and what have you. So there's a lot of helpful resources out there. This is the website for where you can go to get more information about how to change your zone designation and the LOMAC process in general. We'll show that here in a little bit, and we'll actually click through some of those things. This is another one that basically talks about what the types of LOMACs are, how they're different. We're going to cover this in these workshops, but there are tons of online resources that have been developed. FEMA has done a great job of putting resources together to try to help streamline the process. And so we will definitely want to take advantage of that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go over the overview and the process. What is a LOMAC? When do you need one? What types are there? What is this infamous no-rise certification? What does that mean? What are conditional determinations and the different forms, fees, timeline, and other resources? What is a LOMAC? LOMAC stands for Letter of Map Change, a letter that reflects an official revision or amendment to the effective firm. And in that definition, applications are usually classified as two different types. One is amendments, and basically amendments, they're a letter of determination from FEMA, but they don't physically change the effective map. In other words, the scale of your situation may be such that a revision, a physical change of the effective floodplain map isn't necessary. And then the other type of application is revisions. And revisions physically change the map. Think of, you got a project that's going to change the floodplain between counties or in a county for a whole community or a big, large area where the floodway or some other feature is changing. Those type of applications, when approved, they physically change the effective map so that moving forward, anybody that downloads that map, they will see that same update. When do you need a LOMAC? I mean, we do the state and the FEMA, they do their best to try to make our maps living models, living information that can change over time. But the mapping process takes quite a long time when they initiate a large, say, physical map revision or a large county-wide project or watershed-wide project. And so in between that time, there needs to be capabilities for the community or property owners to make adjustments to the map or make determinations on their property based off of the map. So like things like mapping scale limitations or perhaps, something changed from the time that the modeling was done in between that process that changed the topography that wasn't updated. Maybe you have a structure that is technically outside of the floodplain or it's higher than the floodplain, but from a mapping scale, you just can't visually see that. Now in our digital world, that issue has been limited or has gotten better, but still there are things where, the floodplain is so close to the building, it's just impossible for a determination to be made without having a LOMAC done. Or maybe a bridge is updated or something like that. These are all examples of when we want to do a LOMAC. And I like to think of the LOMACs as an important process to help keep our maps up to date, because it does take time, and we can't initiate a mapping project every 2 months. And certainly for our all sanity, we wouldn't want to. We want to make these maps updated as reasonably often as we can. And we want to use the LOMAC process to inform those maps based off of, smaller scale or changes that occur. There are 7 different types of LOMACs, and as I mentioned, these fall into 2 basic categories, the amendments and revisions. You have a LOMA, or a letter of map amendment, and I'm going to give definitions of each of these, so don't worry. CLOMA, a conditional letter of map amendment, letter of map revision, or a LOMAR, a LOMAR-F, a letter of map revision based off of fill, a CLOMAR, conditional letter of map revision, a CLOMAR-F, conditional letter of map revision based off fill, and a PMR, a physical map revision. You're going to see these acronyms talked about throughout the workshop today and tomorrow. A LOMA, or a letter of map amendment, is basically a letter from FEMA. It typically is issued when the scale of a firm does not allow for that area to be shown outside of the special flood hazard area, or maybe the floodplain boundary is so close to a building that a determination could not be made. And so this is a process for FEMA to basically state whether or not a structure or area is not within the special flood hazard area. It's a determination whether it's above or below that. A conditional letter of map amendment is FEMA's comment on basically stating whether, as proposed, the parcel of land or structure, if a LOMA was approved, what is the determination that would be made? So basically think of it as, as it states, as conditional, meaning if you submit an application, that determination will be made. And for a LOMA, it certainly has its advantages, but a LOMAR, where you're actually trying to physically change something out there, a conditional determination is much more important. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. A letter of map revision is FEMA's modification to the effective flood insurance map or boundary map, or both. Basically, there are physical things that are changing, whether they affect hydrology, hydraulics, maybe the topography, or the floodway is changing, or the base flood elevations are changing somehow. But basically, it officially revises the firm or the FBA, the floodway boundary and floodway map, or flood insurance study report. Those things are physically going to change should the LOMAR application be approved. A LOMAR-F is basically like a LOMAR, or a LOMA, excuse me, except that it's a determination for a structure or parcel in which fill has been utilized to put that area or structure above the BFE. So it's a letter of map revision based off of fill, as it's kind of defined. What's important to recognize is a LOMAR-F is an amendment. It does not revise the firm, whereas a LOMAR does revise the firm. So it changes something. A LOMAR-F does not. It's just an amendment. CLOMAR is a conditional letter of map revision, and it's an important tool for you to obtain comment from FEMA about whether or not your activities meet FEMA regulatory requirements, and whether or not, if it was built the way that you're proposing it to be built, whether or not you would have a determination that that property or structure or area is above the base flood elevation. Or, if you're trying to just change the features of the map, the floodplain, the floodway, the profiles, something of that nature, it's FEMA's comment to make sure that your activities are meeting guidance based on FEMA guidance. based off of what you're proposing. What's important to note is a CLOMAR does not officially revise anything. It just provides opinion and provides FEMA's comment on your improvements. The important thing to note, though, is by doing this, it helps limit risk. So if you can imagine, hey, I want to propose to put a ton of fill in a floodway, or I'm going to build a dam somewhere that's going to affect the maps. This is the ability, before you go moving dirt around and have a huge expense associated with that, this is the ability for you to get FEMA's comment to make sure that you're doing that in accordance with their requirements and that the outcome is going to be positive. The last thing anybody wants to do is for somebody to go and do a bunch of activities in the floodplain or floodway and then realize after the fact that something was missed, something was done wrong, and then you got to go back and change it all. So especially if like a building is put up or something like that, nobody wants to see that happen. So this is a conditional a determination, which is important for that reason. CLOMAR is a conditional letter of map revision based on fill, similar to a LOMR-F. It's basically FEMA's statement that conditionally, if the fill was placed, that what that outcome would be if it was actually built as proposed. Again, it's the same purpose. You go and place some fill in there, and you're trying to get that property or structure out. This is a way to get a conditional comment from FEMA to make sure that your outcome is going to be positive, so that you don't go and do those activities and then realize that it was done wrong. A physical map revision is similar to a LOMR, a letter of map revision. So it is a revision application, but it's at a larger scale. Think of multiple counties or watersheds, basically where several map panels are going to be revised. It may be a situation where FEMA decides to deploy a PMR process as opposed to a LOMR process. The PMR certainly must be adopted by the communities. It is a map revision similar to a LOMR. And it's really used to change, like a LOMR, it's used to change flood risk zones, floodplain, floodway boundary delineations, but at a much larger scale than a LOMR, say a single lot site or 2 lot site as opposed to multiple counties. So what is the FABLE no-rise certification? A no-rise certification is basically a report or documentation. It's been certified by a professional engineer that the supporting model or data information that's provided attests that a project or activity will result in a 0.00 foot rise. So if you're trying to place fill or do activities within a floodway boundary, a no rise basically provides, it basically attests to the fact that that activity would not cause a rise, which is required by FEMA. And while it's still recommended, technically, if you have a no rise certification, FEMA in and of itself does not require filing a CLOMAR before doing the LOMAR application, but it's still recommended to do it. Again, we don't want to take the risk that whatever activities are planned are performed, and then something is found to be awry in the analysis that was done. It's just better to go ahead and do that CLOMAR before filing for a LOMAR after that the activities have been constructed. There is additional costs with that, obviously. So you file a CLOMAR, you got to pay for the CLOMAR, and then when you have it constructed, you'll have to do the LOMAR after the fact, which is another fee. And it's basically required if any projects are within a floodway. So just keep that in mind. And of course, if there are local requirements that are more stringent than FEMA's, then keep that in mind as well. So these may be, I know of areas, for instance, in like Canada, where you have to do a no rise for just the flood fringe, not even in the floodway, as an example. So just keep that in mind. As I mentioned before, conditional determinations such as a CLOMAR or a CLOMAR F, they're intended to reduce risk of noncompliance and help streamline the approval process. If you qualify for a CLOMA, CLOMAR F, or CLOMAR, it's basically stating that the proposed project would meet a LOMA, LOMAR F, or LOMAR if it was built as you would propose. If you change, let's say you file a CLOMAR or a CLOMAR F, and you change the way it's actually built during construction, those have to be reviewed, and certainly you would be at risk of non-compliance if you aren't careful. But basically, after you file a CLOMAR F or a CLOMAR, after construction is completed or the fill has been placed, as-built information from the professional engineer would be provided, submitted to FEMA for a LOMAR F or a LOMAR application, and then a determination would be made. Kind of moving right along. So if there are questions, please feel free to speak up. So as I mentioned before, there's several application types, and then there's the 7 different types of LOMACs. What this table shows you is those application types and how they correspond to the LOMAC applications or the LOMAC types. So an MTEZ is basically just a simple survey elevation certificate submission that a structure or property at grade, not on fill, it would be a determination for that. If you're trying to do the MT1 application, so a LOMA or CLOMA, or a LOMAR F and CLOMAR F, as I mentioned before, those are amendments. They're not revisions. You would fill out the MT1 forms for those. And then if you're trying to make a physical change to the map for whatever activity that you have, a LOMAR, a CLOMAR, or a PMR, those you would have to utilize the MT2 application forms. And again, those are revisions, not amendments. So how do you request a LOMAC? So you can submit it on paper or through an online application form. I will bring up the online form so you can see it. So this is the portal that you would go to. You would need to create an account, but essentially all the forms and information that you would need generally are submitted through this online application process. And we're going to talk about a lot of other different things that have to be submitted. Basically what you do is you put in all the basic property information and what have you, and then you just upload a zip file of any other supporting forms like the elevation certificate form or endangered species compliance. Any of those things would be submitted up through this process. The e-LOMA process is actually a process designed for a licensed professional, so surveyors or professional engineers. If you go through this process, it is, as it alludes to, it's an electronic submission for a LOMA. In other words, an amendment. The property cannot be placed on fill. It would be at grade. But if you have a situation like that, then a licensed surveyor or professional engineer, they can submit through this process, and it really streamlines the approval process. You literally get determinations on these in like minutes, as opposed to like a longer review period. So just keep that in mind. And then you can mail them in as well. If you have, maybe you don't have access to the internet, or you just prefer to use the mailing process, you can print the forms, fill them out, and then submit them through the FEMA website has where you submit all that stuff through, which again, I'll show you later here. There we go. So how much does it cost? If you're doing the e-LOMA, it's free. So your land surveyor, your professional engineer, they can go up there and just submit it. If you have a single lot or a single structure LOMA, that's free to file. If you're trying to do a conditional letter of map amendment, a CLOMA or a CLOMAR-F, there's the prices for those, and then LOMAR-Fs. I'm not going to go through all those, but you'll notice that there's the paper form fees and the LOMAC fees. If you're doing this via the online LOMAC website, you just submit your payment information through that. If you're doing it through paper form, I'll show you the paper form here in a minute. You would just fill it out and provide it to provide payment. We're going to cover this more tomorrow, but here's the MT2 application costs. The thing that I would like to point out, though, is if you're doing a conditional letter, a map revision, or a CLOMA, there's a cost for that. And then once the activities are complete, in other words, construction's done and you have as-built showing how it's all changed, and then you file a LOMAR or a LOMAR-F, you would have to submit a separate payment for that. So as an example, right here, you can see a CLOMAR based off a new hydrology, bridge, culvert channel. If you submit it online, it's $6,500. And then once the activities are done, you would submit a second application, a LOMAR application for that same activity, and you'd have to pay $8,000 for that application. The reason for that is they're going to review how the as-built has changed, if it has, from what you submitted in the CLOMAR. So they're still going to review it independently. So there's still a cost associated with that. From a process, a timeline, approval timeline, it can vary. The e-LOMA process basically takes minutes, as I mentioned before. If you're doing an MTEZ, so a LOMA, or if you're doing NT1 amendments, so LOMAs or LOMAR-Fs or CLOMARs, CLOMAR-Fs, those are usually reviewed within 60 days. One thing to note there is they could take 60 days to review the initial application. If you were missing information, then you would have to submit that. So your timeframes could be extended beyond that. But if you're perfect, you submitted everything exactly the way they needed it with all information, technically speaking, they should have their reviews complete within 60 days. The MT2 revisions, they take longer period of time. They can take, once you submit the application, all the way to the revision being effective. In other words, it's gone through an appeal period. The communities have all signed off on it. That can take on average 6 to 12 months. Obviously, the fewer the comments, the better, so that your 90-day in-between period doesn't restart. But just keep in mind that you still have an adoption period. So that is statutory, and therefore, no matter what, it really can't be any quicker than that normally. So if you're looking for help on any of these, again, here are the links to those. If you have any questions, there's a lot of information out there. I'm going to go through every single MT1 application form, and we're going to talk through those. But before I do, I think this is where we have a little quiz that we'll start.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Everyone should be seeing the poll questions. It's a multiple choice, so you can choose as many that fit the question. And please do the poll in order to get CEC credits. If anybody has issues with it, though, let me know. And I haven't really seen any questions in the chat. But now would be a good time to ask questions if you have any that's gone over or anything that John's gone over so far.
And this may go pretty quick if we don't have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Pretty quiet.
Right. I guess another turn though, maybe not questions right now, but questions you hope to have answered through this training could be another feedback that we'd look for. Okay, I think everybody has voted. Sure. I'll leave it up for just a couple more seconds. Great.
All right, so the question was, which of the following are map revisions in which the floodplains on the effective firm or FIS actually change? And you're to select all that apply. And drum roll, what were the answers? So a LOMR is a revision, a CLOMAR is a revision, and a PMR is a revision. Those are all revisions to the map. The other ones are all amendments. So they don't physically change the maps themselves, but they just inform the map through a determination, a letter of determination process. All right. So as Joanna said before, are there any questions or things that you hope to get for this first workshop, the MT1 workshop? People can unmute themselves, right, Joanna? We don't have them like locked out.
Right. I haven't muted anybody, so you should be able to unmute yourself. I think our last one, we had a lot of Steve stories. So that if anybody has any stories also. Yeah, right.
All right, well, I guess hearing none, I'll just go ahead and move forward. This next part of the process, we're going to go through the MT1 applications. You know, what do they cover? What are their requirements? This is a good time where I'm going to pull up each application. We're going to talk through each step of it. If there are questions or if you all have ran across issues in the past, please feel free to share those. We promise not to embarrass anybody. This is an informational workshop, so we want everybody to get something out of it. You know, we'll talk about what the application is, what it covers, the requirements and resources. First of all, the MT1 application, these are amendments. Again, they're not revisions. So applicable to the MT1 application would be LOMAs or letter of map amendments, LOMRFs, CLOMAs or CLOMRFs. Those are all amendments, not revisions to the map. Here's a link to the forms on the FEMA website. We'll go through those. You don't have to click on it or try to find your way to those. We're going to go through each one of those, I promise. But before we get to that, I'm kind of a big picture thinker. So I like to see tables of what's required for each application or application type. So this table basically kind of highlights all the data that's required for each application type. So you can see that, like for an MTEZ LOMA, which is again a determination for a lot or structure that's not on fill. All that's really required is the MTEZ form, a copy of the effective firm, and a stamped subdivision plat map or property deed is all that's really required. And then if you go all the way down to the bottom, you have the MT1 application for, like, say, a CLOM-RF, a conditional letter of map revision based off of fill. For that, you have to submit the property information form, elevation form. The community needs to acknowledge the activity, that it meets their local guidance or requirements. If you're doing it based on paper, the payment information form, copy of the effective firm, the same subdivision plat map. If it's not platted, then a property deed. Design plans, how are you proposing to do it? Since this is conditional, the idea is the development hasn't been built yet. So what's going to be developed? And then also what's important for a CLOMAR, we're going to talk about this more, is the Endangered Species Act compliance part of it. Whenever you submit a CLOMAR, that is required. If you're submitting a LOMAR-F, submitting documentation of ESA compliance, at least at the moment, I think still is not required, although I do know that there's newer guidance coming out for that. But it's still recommended you go through that activity. So anytime that you're doing anything, I'm going to show you how we do an ESA compliance check, even for the simplest sites, and it's very simple to do. So that you all can do that as well for any sites that you might have. Okay, so let's go through the applications. I'm going to bring up the forms we need. 1 second. Where's my forms? Come on. There it is. Okay. Apologize. All right. So this is an MTEZ application. There's a lot of introduction here at the top that talks about what this form is for and how it should be used. As you may recall, the MTEZ is for LOMA only. So in other words, it's a parcel of land or a structure that has not been elevated by fill. And they actually give a definition here of what fill means. But basically, if you've placed material out there that raises the terrain from natural grade, that is considered fill. If you're placing a structure, simple leveling of the ground and then placing a pad, that would not be fill. But if you're putting material out there in order to elevate it, that is fill. As you come down through here, the very first question, they try to foolproof these as much as they can. The very first question says, has fill been placed on your property to raise the ground? And if you answer yes here, it clearly tells you this is not the form for you. So we're going to assume that it's no. So you just check box no. The legal description of the property can come from the surveyor, or the deed, or an abbreviated description from the deed, that's where this information would go. If you're requesting since you're requesting some sort of flood zone determination, you need to check one of these. You got to determine, is this for a structure that's on your property? And if so, what was the date of the construction? When was that built? You can also do for, like, say, a single lot, if you want to do meets and bounds. So you have a surveyor go out there and they survey an area, a specific area, and you have meets and bounds descriptions for that area. You can checkbox this. Or if it's for the entire lot, let's say it's for the entire platted area that's legally recorded, you can checkbox that as well. If you do the portion, just keep in mind that you need to have a certified meets and bounds description of the area that will be reviewed as part of this application. The other items, these are pretty self-explanatory: your name, your email address, mailing address, so forth and so on. That's all that. If the structure is, if you checkboxed that you want a determination based off of a structure on your property, then you would want to check the structure located on natural grade or a LOMA. And it gives a definition of what the lowest adjacent grade to the structure means for the surveyor, so they can provide that information to you. Or if you checkbox the middle one or this middle box right here, then you can checkbox this legally recorded parcel of land as part of this process. Again, the property description is here. So you would insert that information again, the street address, and what type of construction is it. So is this a house on a crawl space? Is it slab on grade? Is there a basement? Those are all important things as they make the determination. Apologize for that. There we go. The geographic coordinate data would also be submitted. Oh, I went too far, sorry. The geographic coordinate data, so you would provide your lat and long of the most upstream edge of the structure. Make sure that the surveyor selects the correct datum units when they're putting this information in. If you're doing it based off of the structure, so you had checked the first option at the top here, and you check this option here, then you would want to make sure that they are filling out this information here. If it's based off of the property, then you would do this in the second box there. If it's a meets and bounds, they would provide that. The NFIP community number, map panel number, BFE, a lot of this information, especially the community number and the map panel number, can all come from the ferment. I'm going to show you how to get the ferment here in just a moment. The base flood elevation is typically derived from, if it's like in a detailed study, it'll be derived from the profiles. And again, the surveyor typically fills this out. The surveyor will provide the lowest adjacent grade elevation to the structure to the nearest 1/10 of a foot, or the lowest grade on the property. So if you're doing meets and bounds, this one would be populated. One of the common issues that we'll often see is people will get their vertical datum mixed up. Just note that you want to make sure that the datum that you're comparing to. So let's say if you pull an elevation from the firm, if it's in GVD 29, then you'll want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples here. We have seen instances where surveyors will go in they'll pull the BFE, the source of the BFE will be in GVD 29. And then they'll put in the elevation in NAVD 88, and lo and behold, they didn't do the proper datum conversion, and all of a sudden you don't have a passing LOMA. So try to ignore that or avoid that at all possible, and just make sure that they are providing you the elevations in the same vertical datum units, so that you don't have that issue. If the area that you're working in has been identified for land subsidence or uplift, so if you're in a sink area, I mean, I know Kansas has a few sinkhole areas and what have you. I'm not really aware of any that are like nationally known, but like I know there's areas in like say California where they've done a lot of water extraction, groundwater extraction. Those areas, certainly those would be subject to land subsidence, and so you would be checking that. And so if you do check that, you would want to provide the date when releveling was done. The rest of this information here, and really this whole box here, is provided by the surveyor, or the professional engineer. They would seal this, and that would be submitted. Again, these application forms, FEMA has done a pretty good job of trying to tell you exactly what's required. And that table that I provided before, you know, a lot of that has come from this, but basically right here has this next section has all the information that's required. So you need a copy of the effective firm. You need the subdivision plat map, or if it hasn't been platted yet, then you can provide a copy of the property deed that's been stamped by the recorder's office, accompanied by a tax assessor's map or certified map of the property. The important thing is to make sure that there are road intersections on that map that are similar to the firm map, so that when the reviewers look at it, they can orient themselves to make sure that the property that's being identified is the correct determination that they're making. Make sure there's a map scale and a north arrow on all the maps submitted. And then it just tells you to keep original copies. If you're submitting this paper form as via snail mail, then they give you the address that it needs to be submitted to right here. And that's a description of your regions. So let's talk really quickly about those forms that are required. So let's talk about the firmet. Let's just go grab one if you've haven't done that yet. And they've actually recently changed this. So, but if you go to the Mapping Service Center, the FEMA website, the Map Service Center, this is what screen will pop up. And there's a couple different ways that you can get to the firmet. The first is they've got a note up here saying how they've been making changes. And to be honest, it took me a minute to find my way back to this to get it. But if you click on this, how to find and make a firmet tutorial, that's one way. So let's click on that. And then you can do an address search right here. And so if you have an address in mind, let's do 245 Waco. Search. So you can see that it brought up the building where that location is. And you can create a firmet by just clicking on this print map or firmet. And we'll just take a few seconds here. Okay, more than a few seconds. While this is taking a moment, does anybody have any questions thus far?
No questions in the chat so far, so feel free to unmute yourself. If anybody hasn't created a format within the last like month or two, the is slightly different. You can see that it looks a little different. They had that old system for a very long time, and it just very recently switched.
Yeah. So there's this way to create the firm map. And here's the format that it creates. So you just download this, and this becomes part of your submission to FEMA. This is perfectly acceptable. The other way that you can do it, I go back. So this is that main page again. The other way to do it is you go to the national, this little link down here, the National Flood Hazard Layer. And you go to this National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. This opens up a ArcGIS Online web application, and you can do the same thing in here. So there that is. And then you can notice here there's this print tool, and Fermet is an option in this print tool, and it'll save it as a PDF format. So you just hit run. Okay. Run. And it'll basically do the same thing where it'll print that same format essentially. And you can tell that, you know, if you got your development on one side of the property, let's say I'm going to develop this parking lot, here's a lot of the information that you're going to need for that form, including the community number, the panel number, the effective date, all that information is right there. And then the BFE, you can tell that they've got the cross-section lines here. So you would just go to the FIS, or the surveyor would anyways that's filling this out, and they could pull these elevations off the profile. So here, you know, if you're pretty close to a cross-section, say the development's up here on this cross-section, you could just pull the elevation from the cross-section. If there's a lot of distance between the cross-sections, then what the surveyor will do is they'll pull up the profile, and they'll actually measure the distance along the line to extract the elevation that's appropriate. And here's the same for a MET form. So you can see that these look pretty much identical. Okay. So that's how you get a fermet. The subdivision plat map and the property deed, again, those all come from one of those would come from the recorder's office or your appraiser's office. And that's all that's required for the MTEZ form. Are there any questions on the MTEZ form?
No questions that I can see. I would know, I think earlier, John, you talked about the different ways you can submit them. And at this point in time, doing online is a much, much quicker than normal even. So because of the COVID restrictions, I think.
Yeah, it is. There's multiple reasons. The snail mail process, they've got to open the letter, they've got to scan it, they got to put it into the system. Whereas the online system is all virtual, all online. And if you're doing something as simple as an MTEZ or even just a normal LOMA or LOMRF, definitely submitting that information online is much faster. You'll get a much faster review and a lot better coordination. So, okay. Okay, so some other MT1 application forms that I wanted to kind of go over. We already talked about the MTEZ. Let's go over the MT1. So this is the MT1 application. You'll notice that with the, as opposed to the MTEZ where LOMA was the only option, MT1 application will have a LOMA, conditional letter of map amendment, a LOMRF, CLOMRF. So you would select the one that's most appropriate for you. Remember that if you have a site that's on natural grade, that is where the LOMA would come into play. If you have if you're trying to make a determination for a site that in which fill was placed to raise the structural or land above the BFE, then that's where the LOMA or the CLOMRF would be take place. You know, they ask you questions. Has fill been placed on your property to raise the ground above the BFE? If you click yes, then obviously a LOMRF should be or a CLOMRF should be selected. And if yes, if it's already been placed, then technically you wouldn't be doing a CLOMRF, you'd be doing a LOMRF. If you're proposing that fill be placed, that's where the CLOMRF comes in and into process or as a requirement here. So if you select CLOMRF, then that means you haven't placed anything yet. You would select yes here. You would put the date for which you're expecting that fill to be placed. And then they've got this little asterisk here that talks about the Endangered Species Act compliance. And this is where I'd like to take a step and talk about the IPAC tool. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife IPAC tool, but it's pretty nice. And hopefully my is still open. So this is the website for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's the information for planning and consultation is what IPAC stands for. And this provides a tool so that you can try to do or help streamline the environmental review process for a proposed project. We'll just go ahead and create one. Okay. Okay, so if you know where your site is, you would just place it here, but I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in on one, some site somewhere I know has some issues. I can turn on the satellite. And let's say right here, I plan on putting in a bunch of fill right here on this property. So what you can do is you can just draw a polygon for where you're planning on disturbing things or where the fill would be placed. Yeah. Continue. And immediately it pops up and it tells you what the potential endangered species are and migratory birds that might be impacted, any facilities or any wetlands. These are all resources. And so you can kind of go through here and you can see, okay, the northern long-eared bat is one. We got the whooping crane. There were no critical habitats noted at this location. All that stuff is right there. What's really neat though is you can look at the migratory birds. aspect, and I'll be the first to tell you that I'm not necessarily a Bugs and Bunny type engineer. But what I like about this is they've got this little calendar here. This says probability of presence summary. And so you can pull this up, and all the migratory birds that have been noted, you can kind of see when their probability of presence would be. And what's nice about this is if you are a developer or if you're trying to plan your construction, you can use this graph and use this as support that you're going to try to mitigate and limit any adverse impacts to these migratory birds by avoiding their breeding season or when they might be present, indicating by these colors here. And so, for instance, if I was trying to develop this site, one of the things that I would try to do is I'm trying to get approval from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or the ecological group is basically I would try to limit my construction within that time window. And when I do this, I use this report as support to submit a letter. And I've got an example of that. To the ESFO, and I'll write a letter that's something like this that basically states that, you know, we're planning on performing these activities. Here are the design plans. All these species that were potentially impacted are noted by running this tool, and that, you know, we're going to try to avoid construction inside of wooded areas or during this time frame. And basically for these reasons, we conclude that the project would not likely adverse impact those species that were noted. And we'll send this letter to the ecological group, and actually on the, I believe that's on here. Let me see if I can, right here, there's your Kansas Ecological Survey. And basically I'll send that to them so that they can respond to it. And basically that letter, this report, and their response acknowledging that is what we will use to help identify or to satisfy ESA compliance. Now, if you've got wetlands, if you've got a lot of other issues, or they come back with something that says you need to mitigate in this way, you're going to have to submit more information to satisfy that. But this is a really good, useful tool to understand what your potential impacts are. And this is not perfect. There are still things in process. I think this wetlands, yeah, they basically tell you that you need to go talk to the Army Corps of Engineers. But at the same time, and I think I have one in here as an example. Oh, I'm not logged in. Hold on a second. Bear with me one moment. Show you, you can actually submit through this online web page to get a regulatory review. My projects. So you can actually start an ESA review right here by clicking this button. Now, as I mentioned before, there are certain activities, migratory birds, facilities, well, and you still have to do the letter. But this is an actually good thing to go through if you're trying to make sure you accommodate compliance and document compliance with the ESA. I say all this, and I wish Steve was probably on because he probably has more information than I do even. I think that they were reevaluating this from a regulatory standpoint with FEMA, and there could be changes coming on how they document ESA compliance. But just know that this tool is available to you. Are there any questions about this part? Because this for a CLOMAR, and again, this ESA compliance is required for a CLOMAR. It's not technically required for, say, a LOMAR or a LOMAR F, but it's still an important process.
It does look like a helpful tool. I haven't ever used it before. I wonder if anybody's used it on the call before. But thanks for showing it.
Man, quiet group. We're have to get them to engage more here. Come on.
It's after lunch, you know.
Yes. All right. Well, some lessons learned with the MT1 applications. Be sure to accommodate for those datum conversions. Oh, I guess I forgot to. I kind of skipped over the other forms, didn't I? It's kind of important. The elevations or elevation MT1 elevation form is another one. It's very similar to what you saw on the MTZ application, but there are some additional information to fill out here. Are the elevations listed below existing or proposed? If you're doing a conditional, then obviously you would select proposed here. For any existing or proposed, you select the same similar type of information that was on the MTZ. What type of structure it is, if it's crawl space, slab on grade, basement. The datum stuff that we talked about, all that is very much the same. It's just a slightly different form. Sorry. Address, lot number, block number. If you've been platted, this information will all be available. And the surveyor would fill this out: the lowest lot elevation and the lowest adjacent grade to the structure. The BFE, pulling that from the profiles and what source, flooding source it's coming from. And then they would certify it. If you had multiple lots or multiple areas, structures that you're doing, you can do multiples here on this other page, and you could have multiples done. The community acknowledgement form, if you are doing a CLOMAR F, a LOMAR F, or what have you, where you're placing fill out there, you would need to get the community to acknowledge the activity. This is the form that they would use. Again, the community number could come right off that ferment, so that's really easy to put in here, and then the property name, address, obviously. And then this is the section if you're putting fill, and then the community will sign off on it. If it's within a regulatory floodway, then this section down here would be filled out as well. The payment information form, it kind of is what it is. It tells you select which application you're doing. So we've been talking about the MT1 application. So you would checkbox that, and this is where you would send it to. And then here's all the information for that. If you're doing this online through the online LOMAC page, you would not use this form. They have their own form that they use. And in fact, the property information form, this one, that's all online. So you wouldn't have to do the paper form for that. You would submit this elevation form with the seal as supporting information, and you would submit a copy of the community acknowledgement form as well. They have not streamlined it on the online system where it automatically forwards that to the community or a community person to sign off on. That's still a manual process. So that's all the MT1 applications. There's There's really not a ton to that. Again, the lessons to be learned here is just make sure those datum conversions are right. It would surprise you how often we see those come in wrong. Be sure to check where that fill is being placed, if it's in the floodplain fringe versus the floodway. If you're in the floodway, then remember, you've got to evaluate the no rise, and document what kind of impact you're having. Make sure that all jurisdictions get a community acknowledgement form. If your development is within a county and the community, make sure that you get sign off from both the county and the community. That's another thing that we've seen in the past, where, they'll submit for the community because eventually maybe it will be platted in with the community. But I have seen that come back where FEMA or the reviewer will basically say, well, right now your site is located within the county and the community, and therefore you need both of them to sign off on it. Check the ESA compliance. I showed you the IPAC tool. It's pretty useful for these activities. Ensure that you're selecting the correct payment level. If there's ever any questions about that, just reach out to FEMA and describe your situation. If you're doing the next bullet there, use approved hydrology and hydraulics. It's not really for the MT1. It'd be for your MT2 typically. But make sure you're using approved hydrology and hydraulic methods. Again, that's why the conditional determinations are very important. If you have a complex situation, just getting FEMA's comment on your activities and your analysis is always valuable, so that you don't waste time and money for the community, for the client, and make sure that everything's in compliance. As Joanna said earlier, the online submissions do streamline the process a lot. Literally, those forms that we just talked through on the MT1 could take you like 10 minutes to go through the online LOMC website, and you don't have to fill out any of those forms, like very many of those forms at all, except for the elevation form and the community acknowledgement form. Certainly recommend doing the CLOMAR F before the LOMAR F, so you make sure that you're in compliance. And really just encourage investing in flood insurance regardless of the outcome of these, I think is important. We should all recognize that while these processes are helped to mitigate risk and costs to our constituents, there's always a bigger flood. And if they're close to the floodplain, there's a chance that maybe there could be a bigger event that would flood them, and it would certainly be worthwhile. Now, risk rating 2.0, that's a whole new story. It's being pushed out. I'm not going to go over that in either of these workshops, but that in and of itself is going to have an impact on the cost structure of insurance. So with that, we've got all the resources again. And then basically I will open it up for any questions. I ended kind of soon because I was hoping we'd have more comments or questions. Does anybody have any situations that they're dealing with now that they have a question about?
I don't see any questions in the chat again, but and I don't deal directly with usually submitting LOMAs, though I have helped someone if there's a lighter base LOMA.
Well, while we got a
kind of a
few
different
minutes
thing.
here, I might just show an example of one that has been kind of how I've basically formatted it so that people can see how I'm documenting and what I'm submitting to FEMA. So if I go back to requirements, this was for a CLOMR or a LOMRF or a LOMR or a CLOMR rather. So it's a little bit different than what I've got sitting up here. But basically, all this information was provided. And I'll probably end up showing this again tomorrow. But the way I try to document this is by numbering these according to the requirements. So this was actually for a CLOMR. And so I was actually doing a CLOMR F, excuse me. So I was doing an amendment, but you can see here how I've got the ferment included. I've got the subdivision plat map in here. In this example, this project did not have a plat. So basically what I did is I just provided a letter, basically said, this has not been platted yet. So instead we're providing the deed in lieu. And so then you have the property deed here, the tax assessor's map. So, I do an aerial view and then a map view so you can see where the property sites are. The elevation form is right here. I open it up. This one was actually credit to Call Valley. This is one that they had provided as part of a survey. Community acknowledgement form. So again, the community number, property name, and then who signed off on it. Here's the ESA letter that was submitted, and I guess I don't have the letter back from Wildlife and Parks that goes in here, but basically I downloaded the IPAC resource list there. Has all that information in it. And then the letter that was submitted. In this example here, we actually had a no rise. So for this no rise, there's actually a report that's provided, sealed by a professional engineer, and it basically documents the means and methods and everything that the site doesn't cause a rise. And then we provide digital models. So hydrology and hydraulics are all included in here. And then the basic form, which I fill this out for my own purposes. But this is going to have like your property information form and stuff like that. Basically, this is all online, so you don't technically need this. I just do it so that if I give it to somebody to fill out online, that's easier for them to do that, essentially.
John, and we do have a question that was sent to me. I think it comes from Dustin, and I don't think he meant to just send it to me, but send it to me by he experienced previously in Jefferson County an issue with neighbors fighting over ag uses, field work, causing flooding on their property. Would a property owner need any of these forms for field work that would change flow, or are they exempt?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the activities are, but we have seen examples of this. I don't know how much I want to share, but for instance, like Marshall County, along the Black Vermilion. I don't know how many people are familiar with that area or not, but basically what happened is a long time ago, Nebraska started confining. They started building ag levees to confine flow. Well, that carried into Kansas. And so basically way back in the day, basically property owners got Corps approval to build these ag levees to protect their ag ground, and it just kept on going all the way downstream. And all of a sudden it created a lot of issues. It basically became the what not to do for floodplain management, essentially. And in those cases, and I think they're still kind of ongoing, there's a lot of issues associated with, getting regulatory FEMA and state approval for those activities. I guess, I'm not sure what the activities are that he's facing, but at a minimum, not just keep in mind, it's not just the FEMA side of these forms, but it's also the state requirements that you need to make or meet. Most likely, if they're making like changes like levies, things like that, that will be the MT2 application forms, which I did not cover today. I'm going to cover all those tomorrow. That talks about hydrology, levees, all that stuff. This would be more for simple fill activities associated with maybe putting fill in a floodplain or floodway, where they're putting up a structure, things like that. But if we're talking about dams, changing the flow characteristics that actually changes the BFE, that will definitely be MT2 activities or revision activities, which will be covered tomorrow for sure. Dustin, did that answer your question? Probably didn't answer your question, but does that?
He does mention he ended up having them talk to Janelle with DWR, and that's who we would typically send people to because it gets into the permitting, and there's definitely some state permits that.
Yeah, you're talking about floodplain fill and stream obstruction permits as probably. Again, I don't know what the nature of the activities are, but yeah, very easily can get into that.
That was a good question.
Yeah, it was. Has anybody ever filed, and not to point fingers or try to make fun of it, has anybody ever filed an MTEZ or an MT1 type application like what I have up on the screen and it not pass? And why? I mean, I think those are, I've done it in the past. I think those are valuable things to know why things don't pass so that we can avoid them.
I'm sure, John, every single one you've ever submitted didn't have any issues, and you've.
Yeah, right. I'm far from perfect. We all know that.
Sometimes it's not even an issue. Sometimes it's just speaking maybe the same language as the reviewers or something.
Oh yeah, no, I remember submitting one that wasn't approved at first, and the reason that, and this was actually for a physical map revision, but the reason that it wasn't approved was because in the report we used the terminology for a model that was called PC Swim, which is basically personal computing stormwater management model. It's basically a piece of software that we use to do hydrology and hydraulic modeling. And the reviewer basically said that model was not approved by FEMA. And what they didn't know, and this is why it's important to talk to actually put in the reports specifically what things are that meet FEMA compliance, but that software is actually a GUI interface. It's not even a hydrology and hydraulic model engine. It's the interface. And as soon as we changed the report to read EPA Swim, which is actually what it was based on, then then the reviewer is like, oh yeah, that is approved and could be approved as part of the application. So it could be little things like that could hang up a review process. So to your point, Joanna, no.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard a lot of little stories like that. Seems like.
Well, and I wish Steve was on here because I actually heard, I think he was the one that told me this story recently, that somebody submitted ESA compliance, similar, using a letter and providing the letter back from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, similar to what I did. And they didn't approve it because it was not an approved method, which is interesting because on the FEMA website, and I'd have to dig it up, it actually states in there that it needs a letter from a federal and local entity that ESA compliance has been met. So again, this is a learning process. I think that they've done a good job trying to streamline it and make it foolproof as much as they can. But it is, there are certain nuances that you have to work around.
Yeah. I'm going to launch the last poll and we can have questions still. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we do need you to have done both polls for credit today. And if you have any issues with it, they'll let me know. Because you could just answer in the chat. It's a true or false question. Yeah, I remember Steve having some stories about the EPA stuff. And some of that, I think those, like you said, they're working on streamlining. I think some of it's just a little bit of, growing pains essentially, or just getting used to what you need for a process. And
yeah, I mean, the process is ever evolving and changing. Certain, certain administrations are different for sure.
Yeah. And so tomorrow we'll go over more the MT 1 stuff, or MT2 stuff, sorry.
Right, yeah, so today was all about the MT1, the amendments side of it. Tomorrow we'll be talking more about all the revision aspects, the MT2 application ones. More complicated, more to them. People will probably have had more issues possibly with those applications. So
Yeah. But if anybody has questions that you think, even like after we get off this call, you can send an email to John or me or Tara, and we can try and answer that tomorrow too.
Yeah, while we're waiting here, I mean, so today again we kind of went over the amendments, the LOMAs, CLOMRFs, those type of things. Tomorrow we're going to do the LOMARs, the physical map changes. Are there things tomorrow that people want to make sure that I cover? Situations that they might have that they would like, input on? Is there anything like that out there? Man, quiet group. Are you sure you don't have the unmute button locked?
Let me see.
I'm sure you don't.
I could ask all to unmute.
I don't want to hear him snoring.
But yes, allow participants to unmute themselves as we have so many visitors. No. Yes, it is still loud. That would have been funny if it wasn't. And then
I think everybody's responded that's going to respond.
yeah, I think I just had to.
So the question was true or false. A LOMA can be used for a structure placed on fill that was constructed after the effective firm date. And the correct answer for this is false. If you have a structure that is placed on fill that was constructed after the effective firm date, then that application process would be a LOMAR F. So that would be a letter of map revision based on fill. It's an amendment, not a revision, but it basically provides a letter of determination for that structure when fill has been placed to raise the structure above the BFE. A little bit of a trick question because if you have the circumstance where a structure was placed on fill before the effective date of the firm, then in the past that has been grandfathered in, and a LOMA could be used in that example. So technically, they could basically state that they did not place any fill. There, and they obviously put the dates of when the fill was in there, and so the LOMA could be utilized in that example. I've seen that done before, anyways. So. Okay. Well, I don't know if I have anything else to really share. So pretty quiet group. Is there anything else that we want to cover, Joanna, while we're here?
I don't think so. I'm not unless there are any questions, but I think that I think if anybody was wanting to ask a question, they probably would have by now. But tomorrow we'll get into the tricky ones. I feel like are those LOMAR ones more. So
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Hey, John.
Well, I don't. Go ahead.
I was just saying thank you for presenting and put this on for us.
Yeah. Thanks for everybody to stick with us. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep. I was able to stay awake through it. Tomorrow we'll cover the MT2 applications. There's a lot more forms associated with that. And it's a little more complicated of a process. So if there are no questions, I guess I'm done.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
I'm gonna stop recording.